All right, brother. So this is a very popular scripture in which I personally like the part where it says, "And if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home." Now, it's interesting because most people won't point that out. They talk about you know, the woman being silent in the quote unquote church, and there'll be this back and forth sort of gender war. But listen, a very close friend of mine recently asked me about my opinion as it pertains to this interview with Dr. Umar Johnson in response to actor Columbus Short from an interview of his own. Shout out to baby girl because clearly she cares about the opinion of a man that she's interested in. So let's scrutinize this.
I want to ask you something Columbus Short said since we talking about that. He
Sure.
said he got some heat for saying that black men are dating outside their race because most black women are raised by single mothers and absentee fathers and taught a don't need a man mentality. What are your thoughts?
Well, we can start with my thoughts. And that dating term, it's indoctrination. It's Western civilization, Babylonian concept. And both do it, whether it's a so-called black woman or so-called black man. They date, quote unquote, because they're taught to do that.
Well, here's what I would say to my brother Columbus Short, and I'm a fan of his. Are we not all victims of the systemic oppression and injustice that racism has introduced into our community? So just as you have black women who didn't grow up with their father, you have black men who didn't grow up with their fathers or their mothers. In other words, why is it acceptable for the black man raised by a black woman without his dad to reject a black woman raised by her mother without her dad?
Well, brother Umar, good question. Let me help you a little bit. This is the very reason why the majority of so-called black women are considered grown children with titties, because they believe, and so some of you believe, that they don't have to be accountable for anything. The only person that get called out for accountability like you're trying to do right now is the so-called black man. He has to be concerned with himself, his own issues, and everybody else's issues at the same time. You mentioned something about culture. What culture? And see, with no culture, you just accept whatever this system designates you as. They call you black, and you just accept it, even though it's not a culture, it's not a background, it's not a race. And so, with the opportunity to let it fall on the women for their issues, again, you blame it on race, you blame it on the brothers, you blame it on everything but the broads committing the acts. And so, yes, while you can point out that the so-called black boys and so-called black girls, sister and brother, are in the same home experiencing the different point of views up under their single mothers, for the most part, the so-called black boys are growing up to be men, and they're changing the narrative because someone has to break the cycle. And so it's interesting that you talk about men and masculinity not acting out of emotions, but that's exactly what point of view you're trying to come from. Because what most young brothers are taught is that chaos is what happens in relationships. They're manipulated and indoctrinated into believing that these chaotic ebbs and flows and roller coaster foolishness, these thrills, this whimsical nature of these grown broads with titties, this is just what happens in relationships, and you gotta endure it. No, real men, kings, are supposed to set the rules of engagement. And so if these women are being more destructive than constructive in a society where they're taught to be the way they are, then it's not the women necessarily that they're rejecting. They're rejecting the chaos, and they're running toward culture. See, that so-called young black son's experience is not going to be the same perspective of the young so-called black daughter. And so while the so-called black daughter has to do everything to not be like her mother and emit a big mama attitude and a little sister attitude, the little brother has to grow up to one day become a so-called black man who rejects the big mama, little sister spirit and toxicity that comes from broads who are more destructive than constructive. Because this is going to be his wife and the one who bears his children. And he has to have scrutinized her enough and done enough intel to come to the conclusion that she is not the big mama energy, little sister energy emitting broad who could bring down his entire kingdom. when it comes down to it, they run to the culture that teaches marriage like the Bible. Because when it comes down to it, you won't find that when it comes down to a Babylonian Antichrist society. You won't find that today. And so once these brothers realize what's really on their hands, it's on them to break the curses, and it's on them to start what Christ intended family to be from the beginning, and not what most of these broads try to do, which is redefine family as what they wanted to do, opposite of even what God says. And that's why you see so much divorce and foolishness, this, that, and other, because more often than not, men are willing to take a ton. Whereas these broads, they, in this current day, these Luciferian, liberal thinking broads, they'll run into these courts and break things in a heartbeat because they know it's going to equal a bag. Even if it's a temporary bag. You know, even if they too emotional to see down the line enough to know that this ain't gonna last. You sold your soul instead of taking on what God intended. And that's why you're gonna come to find out a lot of them they're gonna bury themselves. They're gonna set themselves up for slaughter. So these brothers are out here choosing, when it comes down to it, when they actually come to themselves and they allow the Spirit to guide them and lead them, and they've built a proper relationship with the Most High, understand His way, they're going to choose chaos. They're not going to choose chaos. They're going to choose the order intended by Christ, which makes His model of marriage the original, the authentic, not the Antichrist, not the mimic, not the counterfeit. The man is going to be looking for the authentic Christ-like model, which places the man in the Christ position and places the woman in the disciple position. She's the church. And she got to do what Eve didn't do in the beginning, which is magnify the Lord, her priest, her husband, magnify His purpose. That's why you're a helpmeet, to help magnify. You are, every time you go out, you're a representative for that man. That's true marriage. And because they're not getting that, it doesn't matter what color you are. If you're marrying somebody just because, or you're with somebody just because they're the same color, you're doing yourself a disservice anyway. And so that's why I always say, you go in the direction of the person that's coming in your direction, because you have got to have a teachable spirit and a willing heart and effort when it comes down to true marriage. It's not easy to give up in true marriage.
I think sometimes black men can be guilty of a double standard where we want a perfect offering when we ourselves are not a perfect offering.
Well, when you aim for the definition of perfect meaning flawless, then many people miss that mark. And that's why you aim for the definition of perfect meaning mature, complete, which this scripture by the prophet Paul so eloquently placed. We have a lot of work to do on all sides, but you have to be willing to aim for the complete, mature version of yourselves. And so when men ultimately grow into and mature the desire, it's not hard. It's just peace, maturity, and willingness.
And to that point, I think black men need to recognize the fact that one of the reasons we have so much conflict with black women is because we don't operate on a masculine platform.